Welcome. This is Dan Weingarten with Aging with Freedom, and today we are interviewing author Travis Luther regarding his new book, The Fun Side of the Wall, that's covering the topics of Americans retiring as expatriates in Mexico. And expatriate or expat's just a fancy word for a citizen of one country choosing to live in another country. And we've talked about geo-arbitrage before in Aging with Freedom, and the idea of you can use income earned in a high-income location and live in a low-income location or a low cost of living location, and have specifically highlighted Mexico, partly because of Jerry Brown's travels, and we'd encountered the Mexican communities that cater to American retirees previously, and even were republished in the Mazatlan Post covering that topic. So it was kind of fun to come across Travis's book. And, what I'm really curious about is, we connected online and we ended up finding we had several points of common interests or experience, including that you started out with some experience working with senior residents of planned communities like CCRCs or assisted living communities. What were some of the big insights that you had from that experience? Because frankly, that's our starting point for Aging with Freedom. We thought it was about where to live, and we ended up defining the experience of successful retirement and successful aging is much more than just place bound. But I'm curious what you found with your initial experience working in or with seniors in senior living in the United States.
Yeah, I won't make a claim that my early experience was very extensive, but it's part of a business that I currently own. I know you and I also share entrepreneurship in our background as well. But my company is a legal technology, or one of my companies is a legal technology company, and part of what we do in that company is we make video documentaries chronicling the recovery, or sometimes, unfortunately, the inability for recovery of people who have been catastrophically injured, usually due to maybe it's a medical malpractice case, a car accident, bad luck, somebody slips and falls, or something falls on them in a construction zone. But quite frequently, the people that suffered the greatest injuries were the elderly. They had a harder time recovering. And so what we would be asked to do is go into nursing home facilities or long care facilities and videotape these folks, document what their lives were like, and kind of contrast that with what their lives were like previous to their injury or their accident. And it was there, during graduate school that I first kind of got a sense of what structured planned retirement living or assisted living looked like. And, something that I came away from, that years of experience with was it always seemed to me that those concrete structures and rules were really meant for the companies and the staff for their ease of use, if you will, versus for the comfort of the people who were in there. And I always kind of found that very interesting, because almost everybody I talked to would have preferred to be anywhere else in the world if they could. So
That's a really interesting observation.
yeah.
One of our Lori, my working partner, and spouse, came out of, at one point in her career, the design and construction of senior living communities with one of the major developers. And so we were originally interested in, best practices in design. And what we discovered was that while good design can be complementary or helpful, that it didn't necessarily determine whether there was the successful creation of a sense of community.
Right.
And that sense of community was really important to people's happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the factors that we saw in the most successful communities was an emphasis on resident centered structure rather than staff or even family convenience. That we really structure things for the residents, not necessarily for the convenience of the staff. And conversely, we've seen some really beautiful facilities that were clearly run for the convenience of the staff.
Yeah.
We want to run away from those.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, I think you see kind of a similar shift even in our idea of what makes for good office culture,
oh
because,
yeah, yeah,
I mean, you
absolutely.
you have logistical design in which the person wants to make sure the bathrooms and the elevator and et cetera are centralized, but now it's more about where can we create spaces for accidental or an intentional interaction so that there is more organic opportunity for
And we'll come
community.
back to that
Yeah.
idea of organic growth or
Hmm.
serendipity or the creation of relationships,
Hmm.
because I think that is a big idea that has broad application beyond the specifics of your book. Yeah, and your book, the the future side of the wall,
Fun side.
the fun side of the wall. I'm
So
sorry, it's in
that's okay.
reverse for me. That we really enjoyed that, and it appears to have grown out of your academic work in getting your master's thesis,
Hmm.
but you took it a lot farther than that. And I was really curious, what motivated you to look at this topic beyond just the check mark of getting that master's degree and completing the thesis?
Yeah, I mean, it was all rather accidental. I think is most of the interesting things that come out of our
Serendipitous.
lives are. Yeah, um, I entered a graduate school at a time when you know commerce on the internet was really taking off, and I saw that these people that operated in businesses similar to mine were able to travel all over the world and enjoy the world and operate their businesses from laptops and even manage their companies from laptops. And so that was kind of where I first got interested in this idea of expats, of people leaving the United States and going and living in other places in the world. But something that always kind of bothered me or confused me was I grew up in rural Washington on the Washington-Idaho border, and largely my life was spent in rural, conservative, small communities in which we came to accept and believe that the United States offered the best of everything, and we just didn't really question that. USA was always number one. And so what was interesting to me is why would successful people or successful entrepreneurs want to leave the United States if this was the best place ever? And so that's kind of where I got interested in this idea of expats. And so when I entered graduate school, my advisor said, well, you can't survey the world. If you're interested in why people leave the United States, then you need to find a small group of them that are accessible and go study them. And so through some more research, I located this pocket of baby boomer expats who were living in this lake village in Mexico, and found someone else who had done a study on them. And he kind of opened the door to me taking a trip down there and interviewing them, which was my first trip out of the United States in my life. Um, so I largely went down there expecting to, find poor people who couldn't afford to retire in the United States retiring in Mexico. I expected to find Mexico to be, a poor place where, as I kind of joked in the book, people would be asking me if they could just come back to the United States with me, because in the media, the rhetoric running over and over at that time was that, they were busting down what was there of the wall to get into the United States. And I just didn't find that at all. When the thesis was published, um, I just continued to get a lot of emails from people who'd found it online, or had heard about it and wanted to know more about it. And so a couple of years ago, I decided I think there's room for a book on this topic, and I can kind of redo my research, cover more of Mexico, not just the one village that I originally started with, and offer something a little less on the stat side and more on the social science side, so that it's accessible to more people. And so that was the motivation to write it.
You mentioned in kind of your own entrepreneurial background, and my background includes founding and running a venture capital fund, and I've been an entrepreneurial coach for the National Science Foundation's Lean Launchpad program with Steve Blank, and currently I'm national faculty and state faculty for Goldman Sachs 10,000 small business. So a lot of entrepreneurial exposure, experience. And, I kind of look at your background, and you've done a lot of things. And so, the taking a look at this information, of this data, and say, oh, there's some entrepreneurial opportunity here, maybe shouldn't be surprising, because you've done that more than once. What would you share a little bit about some of your other, entrepreneurial experiences? And for instance, you mentioned the some of the things with regards to the legal practice. So what the heck is lawfather and, trial line, those sorts of things. Share a little bit about your entrepreneurship, because I think that has a lot of attraction for some of the planners that are thinking about both their own career, preparing for retirement, and even retirepreneurship in retirement, that a lot of us do continue to do things past when we stop working for other people. So this common foundation in entrepreneurship, I think, is really interesting.
Yeah, going back to my background, not only was I a rural kid, we were a poor family. My mom got pregnant with me when she was 15, and by the time she was 19, she had 3 boys and was on her own. So we grew up.
Necessity is the mother of invention, right?
I mean, that's it. We grew up really poor, food stamps, government cheese, all of that stuff. And I can't exactly pinpoint when it was, but I think it probably coincided with having a paper route or something like that. But I just started to believe that being a business owner, I never described it as entrepreneurship at that time, but owning my own business or doing something on my own, excuse me, was going to be my path out of poverty. And so from a very early age, I was putting up flyers trying to collect the recyclable aluminum for the neighbors, or I was pet sitting, or I was doing the newspaper delivery. And, I just kind of stuck with that, even through all these failures that I had early on in my entrepreneurial career. I just kept trying ideas. And I think there was like a little bit of an aha moment for me, probably about 15 years ago now, where I had opened, run, and burned to the ground several businesses, and had returned to Denver to college here, and was kind of following that path that all the other people tell you to do, which is like, you just need to stop with these dreams. You just need to go to college. You just need to get a job. And so I was kind of broken at that point. And I was going, okay, well, maybe that's what I need to do. And when I had just started school, I had joined a marketing club, and I had gotten this idea to sell advertising on valet tickets, because I was working at night as a valet while I was going to school during the day, parking cars. And just in short, that business really took off. It was the most successful business that I had ever had. And my aha moment was that, I really had needed those first 10 years of failures to learn the lessons that allowed me to succeed past that. And the big lesson there was, I had been following that, follow your folly. If you do what you love, you never work a day in your life kind of philosophy around entrepreneurship. So I looked at everything that I enjoyed doing as a business opportunity, and not as an opportunity to solve problems for people. And so my businesses were largely failures because they were self-serving. They were just fun things that I wanted to do, but they weren't so fun that other people wanted to pay to do them with me.
You're missing the customer market.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So with the valet ticket advertising company, it wasn't anything that I was terribly passionate about, but I had realized that I was the person in the perfect position to execute on a good idea. And the problem was that affluent people wanted to reach consumers so that they could sell them expensive cars and condos and things of that nature. And I had found a way to solve that problem for them. So, from that point on, I looked at entrepreneurship as not this follow your passion, but can you find a problem, that people would be willing to pay money to solve?
Yeah, a problem worth solving.
Yeah. And so, from there, I met a lawyer, ended up marrying her, but she kept referring people to me who needed some kind of marketing help or graphic design help. And I realized,
as a recovering lawyer, we love the fact that somebody will love us.
Yes. So I realized again that, hey, there was another problem there. There was not a technology company that just served the really specific needs of lawyers. And so from there, we launched Lawfather, which in the beginning just kind of did graphic design and web design for lawyers. And now we do all sorts of media related projects, including going to trial with attorneys, renting them all their AV equipment, sitting there running exhibits and demonstratives. We had another problem pop out of that business, which was timelines. Lawyers wanted to make timelines for cases, and the process to do that's very tedious and expensive if you have to hire a graphic
And
designer.
it's important in explaining complex cases to, the average person who's sitting in a jury or even to the judge to, to kind of hold the narrative thread together.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. So, our own frustration of having to make timelines over and over again and going through that very tedious process, I said, there's got to be an online template that we can use so that we don't have to keep
We
doing
can make this easier.
Yeah, and there wasn't. So, since we had a coding team that was doing the websites, we put it on them and we said, hey, come up with this little timeline for us. And so that launched as Trial Line about 6 years ago now, and that's been very successful. And then I own a company called Queen Anne Pillow, which is a luxury pillow manufacturer. And the problem there was largely mine. I had a bad back. I had a couple back surgeries, and I would see claims by pillows that we can solve your neck pain. I thought, is there a pillow that can solve my back pain? And as anyone who's gone through this process knows, there are thousands and thousands of pillows to choose from, but they don't tell you what's the difference between a $5 pillow and a $500.
And they don't tell you how to choose which one is specific to you.
Exactly. So we created an AI type algorithm that took customer data, largely from returns, as well as good reviews and bad reviews, and put that all together into a survey that if you answer these 8 questions within a 93% accuracy, it will give you the right pillow for you. And so
actually, that's really great. I love the use of data to inform how to buy, not just what to buy, because that's the real problem that consumers, or for that matter businesses, have, is that even when they know they have a problem and there's a host of options out there to buy, no one likes to feel like an idiot or wants to make a mistake with their dollars. So the how to buy smartly question is really important. So that use of data to help solve that, that's brilliant. I love that. That's great.
Yeah.
In the book, you talked about your move from an undergraduate major in marketing to sociology, and you kind of fiddled with the law a little bit at one point in time. I always look at sociology and psychology as very closely related to marketing. Marketing's almost applied sociology or applied psychology.
Sure.
You just mentioned some of the big lessons that you learned from doing in the real world that maybe didn't get done in the undergraduate classes. Can you share a couple of those big insights that you've had in terms of what makes for successful marketing, or now that you've worn that entrepreneur hat successfully more than once, as well as, that painful lesson that I've got to solve somebody else's problem, not just my own?
Yeah. I think speaking specifically, right? So it's funny, I had a conversation with somebody else earlier a little bit about what you were talking about people retiring later and starting lifestyle businesses there, and that's exactly what we were talking about. But what I was saying to this woman is, okay, well, who is your product or service for? And she said, oh, well, it's for everybody. And I said, but no, who's it really for?
Yeah, big red flag, right?
Yeah, right. It's like, well, it's for anybody. And I said, okay, well, if it's for anybody, you should be able to tell me one very specific person who it's for. And often I'll tell my students or people that I'm consulting with, just stare at the door. Just turn around and stare at the door and describe for me the person who walks through it that for 100% is going to buy your product or service. And I think that, what I've learned in the advice that I give these days is that you, as we say, you get rich in your niche, right? And you have to really understand
deep and narrow is better than broad and wide.
That's right.
We can't afford to market to everybody.
That's right. That's why this book is about baby boomers in Mexico and not everybody, all expatriates and all over the world, right? It's a niche.
Smart.
But, yeah. But at any rate, that's one of the things that I've learned is you have to be able to vividly see and understand who those people are who are already a great fit for what it is you have to offer. And then you can expand to everybody in the world from there. But you can't do that if you can't identify a singular customer.
Well, and, coming back to the book, The Fun Side of the Wall, writing a book is itself a little bit of an entrepreneurial venture. Can you tell me a little bit about your life as author and speaker and promoter of a book? Because that's a job in and of itself.
It is a job in and of itself. I don't know. I don't know what I would say about doing it again. I mean, I'm almost done with the second book now. You know, I decided to self-publish this book because our other businesses are very successful on Amazon. So I really felt like I had a good understanding of that. But what I've come to realize is that book marketing and pillow marketing are totally different things. And so, you know, what I've one thing I will say is that you have to treat it like a job. Like anybody who wants to write a book, they ask me, how'd you do it? Or how do you do it? And I said, you got to set time aside for it, just like anything else, you know. And for me, it was always the early morning, you know, the 6 to 7 o'clock spot before my kids got up and I had to get them ready for school. And sometimes I would just have to sit there frustrated because I didn't know what to do or where to write next. And other times I would just be, you know, getting tons and tons of stuff done. And I think, as Hemingway always said, it's a good place to stop when you know exactly what you need to do next. That gets you in the chair the next morning. You know, I was on a call with, I don't know if you know this guy, Tucker Max. He's a author who wrote this book, I Hope They Serve Beer in Heaven, or I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell. He's he's in a entrepreneur group that I'm with, but basically his book is about almost like psychology. Like if you're a jerk enough and you get people to think you're a jerk, then they'll spend all their time wanting you to like them, and then you can like pull them into your sphere. It's really kind of, and that's why it's in hell is where the beer needs to be served. But he was saying, you know, traditional publishing these days is really dead. It's a lot like, you know,
it's a business that has changed
yeah.
fundamentally just within the last 10 years. So.
Yeah. And this is a guy who sold almost 5 million, you know, copies of books. But what he said reminded me largely of the music business when Napster and all of this stuff kind of came around. Was nobody is going to sign an author who does not already have 25,000 people in their social media following or something ready to buy the book. And so the truth is, any aspiring writer is going to have to go out there and basically do what I'm doing, which is to build a following and build interest around yourself to the point where you almost don't need them anymore. And then they'll swoop in with a check and share the money with you, right?
It's like getting a loan from a bank is easier when you don't need the money.
That's what I always say. That's what
right?
I always say.
Okay,
Yeah.
the perfect illustration.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, coming back to boomers, yeah, you can tell from my gray hair, I kind of fall into the category. And it's interesting that as a, you know, non-boomer, you chose to focus on this narrow niche of the expat community in Mexico. And one of the things I really appreciated was you distinguishing between the leading edge boomers and the trailing edge boomers. Both my wife and I are trailing edge boomers, and we definitely see differences in experience and perspective from falling into that younger half of the baby boomer cohort. You know, we're still at the early retirement stage, whereas the leading age is now over 7, or leading edge is now over 70 and is, you know, strongly into that retirement era. And a lot of this trailing edge, we're still thinking about it, or, you know, in that transition. You know, I'm more working for myself these days than for other people, have more free time from that. So I say I'm kind of partially retired, but, you know, still making money, not relying upon Medicare or Social Security yet, right? And I don't think that's unusual. But you started out with like 3 reasons why Americans might move to Mexico. Can you share what those 3, you know, like guesses were in terms of why somebody might choose to move to Mexico for retirement?
Yeah, in my original thesis study, the one that was published in 2011, it was strictly financial. So my hypothesis was that low-income people would move to Mexico as a way to retire comfortably.
And you look at the cost of living in Mexico compared to the United States, and you've got some statistics in the book, but housing is like half as expensive for comparable housing in Mexico. Food is cheaper, you know, almost everything. That healthcare is a lot cheaper, and healthcare is one of the big, you know, worries of people preparing for, especially early retirement, where we're not yet ready for Medicare. But
right. Yeah, it's, I mean, 200% on average, right? 200% lower cost of living.
So big savings by going to Mexico. So that's big. That's a good guess, right?
Right. Yeah, that was a good guess, because in my mind, I never was like, oh, Mexico's a great place, like it didn't exist for me that way where, where I grew up. As I keep trying to admit, I was not a perfect egalitarian person. I grew up with beliefs that came from my surroundings, and I never, outside of the beaches, I never thought of Mexico as, I didn't really have much of an opinion of it, but I didn't have a great opinion of it, if that makes sense. Um, and so and so when I finished that study, I definitely knew there was more to the story. And so so in this book, I look at finances is the first kind of hypothesis. Will low income people go to Mexico as a way to have a comfortable retirement? Two, does ageism and a consumer culture motivate them to leave the United States, or are they pushed out because of something that happened culturally here?
So kind of cultural disassociation.
Exactly. And then three, authentic community. So is there something lacking here with regard to community that they've found in Mexico? So those were the three areas of study this time around. And then a little bit on the employment side, which is more related to finance, but
I don't want to give away the entire story because
yeah.
I thought it was an insightful book with some really great statistics and some interesting conclusions. But was money the big motivator?
Money was what interests most people, or let me say this: money is what made most people look into Mexico, but they were also looking into other places like Belize, Costa Rica, Panama, etc. as well. So while money was a consideration, it wasn't a consideration as much as, well, look, I don't have enough money to retire or I don't have enough money to retire comfortably in the United States. It was, I want to retire earlier than my counterparts in the United States. I don't want to work past 65 or 67. And so it was people who worried about money and how money affected their lifestyle that were more likely to move to Mexico, not people who didn't have money.
So more of the planners wanting to make sure that they had the money for freedom of choice in their life so that they could spend more time in retirement, maybe doing what they enjoyed rather than having to keep working.
That's it. That's exactly it. Because compared to their counterparts back in the United States, the Mexico boomers, as I refer to them in their book, are far more affluent. In fact, most of them live somewhere.
And that was a surprise to me is
Yeah.
that both on education and on income, they were on the better educated, higher income end of the scale. They were not necessarily those that were struggling through life in, manual labor type of job. Maybe education, healthcare overrepresented.
No, I mean, like I said in the book, if the Mexico boomers were their own generation, they would be the most educated generation we've ever had in the United States. 25% of them had at least a bachelor's degree, 16% of them had a master's or PhD degree. I mean, they would have been the most educated generation we've ever seen. And then financially, like I was saying, they mostly operated in the top 50 to 25 percentile of income. So these were people who could definitely afford and had the resources to retire in the United States.
They weren't part of the retirement crisis that we were talking about for boomers not being prepared with retirement savings. They've had pensions or the wherewithal or savings, maybe even just inside the house, which is where a lot of baby boomer wealth is located, in order to have some choices about what they want to do for retirement and when to retire.
Sure. And so that's not an exclusive profile. I definitely found people that I expected to find originally, who were living just off Social Security, who, just were barely making ends meet.
But it goes farther in Mexico, right?
But it goes a lot farther. And then going back to that healthcare aspect that we talked about, there is a socialized healthcare system there that residents, if you become a temporary or permanent resident in Mexico, you can take advantage of. And that's kind of that arbitrage that you speak of. I mean, your costs are cut way lower than they are in the United States.
So one of the things I looked for and I didn't find in the book, and maybe this is one of those things that in hindsight you would have structured your survey differently as well, but do you have a sense for, did people choose to retire early? Were they forced to retire early by economy? by life changes, by health, by circumstances? How much choice, how much I've got to do something because I'm retired, whether I want to be or not, happened to make those 5 year earlier than the rest of us retirees?
Yeah, so when I completed my first study, I had heard, or I had spoken to a lot of folks down there who had told me that they had retired early because they had kind of been pushed out of employment. So, but take in mind, this was during the 2007, 2009
The
financial
Great Recession,
crisis.
right?
Exactly. And so I left Mexico with a sense that maybe that was happening. And what it turned out to be is that those statements to me were probably not the norm, right? So having two studies is kind of fun because I can kind of look at what the climate was like during one recession, and then I can fast forward to, 2018.
2018 was actually, kind of the end of, we didn't know COVID was coming or
Right.
the coronavirus, but it's kind of the end of a very long boom in historical terms.
Yeah. And so what I saw was kind of two groups, right? I had seen 10 years ago a group that had come down that was different than the group that had arrived more as of late, right? So it was like really much leading edge and trailing edge baby boomers that I was capturing. And so when you look at the group
Different experiences, right?
exactly. Yeah. So when you look at the group overall, in general, no, losing their employment or being forced out of employment was not a big motivator for why they left, even though they did talk about it. But it certainly was not as big of a motivator for the newer arrivals as it was for those who had suffered during the 2007 through 2009 financial crisis.
So out of curiosity, any idea on kind of the geographic origins of where those that chose Mexico to retire came from? Is it equally distributed across the country? Is it concentrated in urban areas? Is it from rural areas? I kind of, this is a guess, but my
Yeah.
guess is that because of the relatively lower cost of living in rural areas and closer sense of community that exists in a lot of smaller towns
Mhm.
or rural communities, that some of the other motivations that you talk about may be more appealing to urban residents in the United States. Just curious, do you have a sense for where people came from before they ended up as expats, retirees in Mexico?
There's so many other questions that I asked that didn't get included in the book because I couldn't really look at the data and form anything statistically significant. But that the state of origin and city of origin and stuff was something that I considered when I tried to cross it with motivations. I just didn't find anything relevant there. But my guess, kind of off my personal experience and anecdotal evidence, is that it's more likely than not that these folks come from urban areas, just as you've described.
Given the education levels,
Right,
that would be
exactly.
kind of a natural consequence of you go to the big city with the education, or you
Right.
stay where you got your degree. Those types of things are very common, right?
Yeah, you're not doing a lot of aircraft engineering in Boise, Idaho, for
Right.
example, or
Right.
something.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. One of the other things that was really interesting was the kind of the skew for single women and
Yeah.
maybe the freedom for self-actualization that the expat community offered singles, and particularly single women. I thought that was an interesting discovery. Can you share a little bit about that as a potential motivation? This is maybe counterintuitive because, just like you were talking, a lot of people have this perception of the risk of a foreign country, whether
Hmm.
it's Mexico or somewhere else.
Right.
And yet, women who we generally think of as more personal security conscious,
Hmm.
seem to be choosing that Mexican expat retirement experience in higher percentages than men.
Yeah, I mean that was that was totally unexpected. That was one of those things where I was kind of going through my charts and I was like, look, and then I was going, wait, what is this? What is it? And I was like, I found something. I found something. Um, um, But yeah, because I was just kind of going over the marital data, single, divorced, and blah 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 blah, and I saw this big number jump out at me. It was something like 2 or 3 times the number of single women than single men had arrived in Mexico in this secondary study, and again, going to the safety concerns, the same thing too, and so as I described down there, well, when I say this, I kind of reflect on the state of divorce among baby boomers in general, right? And so,
And gray divorce is an issue, right?
yeah.
That's something that's distinctive about the baby boom generation, that the silent generation was not particularly common, and even later generations, are not, now they're not getting married as frequently as baby
Hmm.
boomers did either, but they're also not getting divorced with the same frequency that baby boomers have.
Right, right. And so something that we know from many years of sociological studies is that women suffered more dire consequences in divorce than men do. And especially this is the case with baby boomers, because even though it's not as common as it was for the greatest generation, still women served as the primary caregivers for children and were in the home a lot longer. And if they went back to work, it was later in life. And so they just accumulated a lot less in personal retirement or personal property than their male counterparts did. And so unfortunately, in a divorce, they lost some of that. And then if they faced a financial consequence where you and I may be able to dip from a 401k or something like that to help get us by, generally they had to deplete a lot of what was in any retirement accounts that they had to get through those tough times.
I was really shocked that the much higher percentage of women have kind of suffered the penalties or financial consequences of an early 401k withdrawal.
Mm-hmm.
That was an interesting little tidbit of data that was buried in the book that I thought, oh, this is a point of different experience that would definitely affect my retirement planning if that's where I had been in life.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. So what I had discovered was all of these single women had decided to make the move to Mexico. One, as a way to kind of counter some of the financial consequence of divorce, and two, just looking for a place where they financially could be independent, personally be independent,
Fresh
and so
start.
fresh start. And so, as opposed to the women that I talked to 10 years ago in the original study, who largely arrived, with a spouse. These women were arriving in Mexico sight unseen. They were meeting people in Facebook groups or in international living magazines, and they were making the decision to leave. I think there was that one narrative that I put in the book for the woman who actually said, I have a dream for myself. She said this to her husband. He said he was going to do it. He would not get on board. She divorced him. They're still friends, but she was just called to Mexico. They had gone down there for a trip. And she said, I got to do this for me. And there was just, as I describe in the book, so much grit and adventure among these women. They were just like such a blast to hang out with. These were the ones who tugged me by the ear from bar to bar to restaurant to
I've
restaurant.
got a story to tell.
I mean, yeah, it was great. I mean, I had the best time. And then there was like, they were telling me about the dating scene and the kind of the infighting, and I mean, it was a lot of fun. But I think, just as you alluded to, I mean, the point there is that single women, baby boomer women, didn't feel like Mexico was a danger to them. More often, they felt Mexico presented an opportunity for them to live financially independent and to start a fresh life in a
And for
community that they
empowerment,
love.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, okay, coming back to some of the other kind of interesting demographic tidbits that, we're kind of in the moment of uh, the importance of the life experience of Black Americans or African Americans with what's currently going on in the country. And it was really shocking to see that the racial distribution of Americans choosing Mexico as an alternative, uh, that there were so few Blacks or African Americans that had that. Is that Mexico's adverse to African Americans, or African Americans somehow adverse to Mexico? What's the story there? That's a surprising outcome, particularly given your original thesis that finances might drive people to choose Mexico
Yeah.
for retirement. And, I thought your discussion of this in the book was particularly astute. So,
Thank you. It was a tough thing for me to write for a couple of reasons. Number one being, like, as I said in the book, I could only find one to my knowledge, one African-American person that did an interview and a survey with me.
Really small sample, right?
Yeah, really small
That's a
sample.
problem.
It is a problem. But so I kind of had to draw some conclusions based on data in the United States, because I couldn't ask African Americans in Mexico why they were so much less likely to retire in Mexico. But what we do know about immigration in general is that people who successfully immigrate do so because they have a strong social network that's already there, or they have some kind of community binds or family or friends. And so when you start from the premise that just not very many.
And think about the pattern of immigration in the United States, where, you know, one member of the family might, you know, pioneer the homestead in, you know, northern Minnesota, and, you know, suddenly you've got hundreds of Norwegians, right?
Exactly. That's exactly it. And so that's, you know, it's like I said, it's changed in the last 10 years. More people are willing to show up in Mexico unknown, but they do have some community there that they've either developed online, or they did have friends or family that have moved before.
What was it, the Lake Chapala
Yep.
Society?
Yeah, so there you go. That's a group that's been in existence for 70 years, right? So they have a really strong social network that can support people coming down. With regard to the African American community, it doesn't exist. It's not there. So I don't know how many have attempted to make the move, but we do know that people are more successful in immigration if they have a welcoming, supportive, familial, or friendship in a community where they arrive. And then we have to look at the financial demographics, because I talk about poverty actually being an invisible border to the people who may need or appreciate Mexico retirement the most. And what
your Hurricane Katrina example was great. Go through that, because I thought that was brilliant.
Right. So you take this idea that people who need financial assistance the most, and you look at them and you say, well, then why don't they just go to a place where they can thrive, or where their cost of living can be lower? And the truth is, because the resources don't even exist in the community at that moment that would allow them to do anything like that. And so I think the Hurricane Katrina example I was trying to give was, there were so many pundits that were saying that these African American folks who were in New Orleans, they acted as if they had some choice, right? As if they chose to stay there. You know, they should have gotten their cars and they should have gone to their families in
As the
Houston.
13th Ward flooded.
Yeah, exactly. Like, they should have done all of those things. And the truth is that those folks didn't have that option, right? That was where their community was. That was where their family was. There was nowhere to flee. There was no money to flee with. There was no car to flee in. And so trying to act as if those were choices, I think was an unfortunate stigma that came out of that situation. And I think it's similar to why we don't see more African Americans in Mexico, is because the resources that they need to even get down there, not all of them, but to get down there and be successful, don't exist. And unfortunately, what more of us are coming to understand now, I mean, certainly I knew this 10 years ago, but is that African Americans have been in poverty longer than Caucasians.
The income, you had some basic U.S. demographics, and it takes an awful lot of difference in order to end up with those average differences in household income by race. It's like $10,000 to $15,000 or more, depending upon the state, and you know those are huge differences.
Huge differences, yeah. So the resources for a move like that aren't there. And then the other complication is, and this isn't just for African Americans, it's even for some of the Caucasians who are on the lower income side.
Well, it might explain why you didn't find very many low income
right
people in proportion to your expectations.
Exactly, because if you're dependent on any kind of welfare or government assistance, if you're dependent on Medicaid or Medicare for your health care, you could not use that outside of the country. And
okay, so there's a couple of warnings that you have built into the book. So for instance, the ability to use Medicare, the U.S. program for healthcare for those over age 65 or the disabled, is limited. So you can't use your Medicare benefits in Mexico.
Yeah, it's virtually impossible. I don't remember what the exception is. I think maybe something to do with the military, but you just can't use them. And so if your entire healthcare is dependent on Medicare, then you don't have healthcare in Mexico. And that creates, like I said, an invisible border to those people who might benefit best from being able to retire in Mexico.
But it also kind of explains the kind of the early retirement connection of Mexico is that that's actually one of the challenge for early retirees in the United States with our convoluted healthcare system is,
Mm-hmm.
how do I pay for healthcare when I stop working for the big guy and I'm
That's right.
working for myself or I'm retired if I retire before age 65 and Medicare eligibility. Yeah, there was another warning that, it wasn't, like red label or anything,
Mm-hmm.
but, particularly if you've retired early, concerned about, job opportunity in the United States, it's important to understand that you just can't go down to Mexico and start working in Mexico. You want to explain both working in Mexico as an American and maybe opportunities for entrepreneurship that are less grounded in geography. Your original thesis of, I can work from a laptop from anywhere, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's like, this book only covers baby boomers, but I have another little study coming out that covers more of the generations. And that's the bulk of what you see there. You see younger generation, the people within younger generations moving to Mexico, working from laptops for American companies, collecting American dollars. And in that way, they're living a great life. They cannot There's not many of them that can come to Mexico and work for a Mexican company and earn comparable wages to the US. They just don't exist.
And Mexico has fairly restrictive work requirements for Americans that are fairly both time and bureaucracy intensive of getting through.
Right. So if you just show up in Mexico and you don't have any kind of resident status, then you just basically can't get a job. The way that you can get a job for a Mexican company down there, and just to clarify, you can work for an American company in Mexico and collect wages in America.
Right.
But to work for a Mexican company and collect Mexican wages, you have to have some kind of residency status, and that's either temporary or permanent. And once you have that status, which isn't terribly hard to get, then you can start working for Mexican companies. The thing that's great about that is then you're eligible for the different Mexican healthcare insurance plans, which are way cheaper than anything in the United States.
Yeah, another one that was like half as expensive or more than, the cost of healthcare in the United States, and not significantly different, at least at the primary care or maybe some of the highest end tertiary care, like Johns Hopkins or
Yeah.
MD Anderson or something like that, is
Mm-hmm.
different. But largely, people are trained to the same standards, maybe even in the same colleges.
Right.
That's one of the things you share, that there's actually a medical tourism to go
Yes.
to Mexico for less expensive healthcare.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the people that are there that get residency, I'm just going to put this, number out there. Don't hold me to it, but they're paying maybe $100 a month for their health insurance as a temporary or permanent resident living in Mexico, taking advantage of that care. Their largest complaint is that it takes longer to get an appointment for non-emergency stuff than it would maybe in the United States. But as far as the level of care, they all find it very comparable. And like I said and alluded to, there's this huge medical tourism movement where people are coming to Mexico for major surgery. They're coming for experimental cancer treatments. They're coming to get access to drugs and treatments that they just can't get because of, dare I say, bureaucratic restrictions in the United States, right? We think of Mexico as very bureaucratic. But so what they do care about, and this is really interesting, is you have to keep in mind that the Mexican culture is one where it's very familial, right? So you take care of your folks as they get older. Our culture in the United States, you put your folks in some kind of place, right? And somebody else takes care of them, or you put yourself in a place and somebody takes care of them. So the only concern that a lot of these folks express is that as I get older, if I develop a chronic condition where I need 12 or 24-hour assistance, there isn't anywhere for me to go in Mexico. I don't have a family that is going to take care of me. And there is not the big assisted living or nursing care facilities and structure that in Mexico like we have in the United States. So that becomes kind of the longer term concern. But what I've noticed over the last few years,
So that's a question about sustainability. Is
right?
it may be a first stop in retirement, but it may not be the last stop. You may have to come back to the United States at some point if you want some of those services that are more closely tied to Medicare, or that are more a feature of American senior living.
Yeah, but what I was going to add is over the last couple of years, I've seen these types of facilities popping up in these
Ah,
communities.
interesting.
So
Okay.
somebody like you and
So,
me has said, there's
opportunity.
1.5 million people down there that have nowhere to go. And yeah, so you're starting to see them. And, I mean, I think that private care costs here are average somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 a month, right, out of pocket.
Right.
And,
Yeah,
and
long-term care is expensive if you either home care or in a facility. So
yeah, and I think I
yeah,
was seeing
it gets
numbers.
expensive fast.
I was seeing numbers of American style long term care there for $800 a month. So if you've
And that compares to, like, I think the national average is something like 70,000 a year for a long-term care, skilled nursing or something like that.
yeah,
So
yeah. So if you are retiring early, you're saving a ton of money, you're taking advantage of Mexico's public health care, then you probably can't afford to continue to sustain your lifestyle in assisted living in Mexico. With
so
that.
So that's a good bridge to that discussion about what makes for an authentic community, or beyond kind of the pretty architecture of the red tile roofs and
Mhm.
the stucco and the greenery of Mexico. What makes for successful communities where people want to retire and have not just the financial security, but the emotional rewards?
So I think that really came down to relationships of reciprocity. As I said in the book, what was most attractive to these folks was that they could go to a place where there was a strong support network and they could be helped, but also help at an equal level, which is different than going somewhere where it's expected that the staff or everybody else will take care of you.
We
So
hate to ask for help, but that sense of rest, if an exchange feels better to us, I think, emotionally.
right, right. And so that is the culture of retirement in Mexico for expats and maybe even for Mexicans. I can't claim to know how Mexicans retire as well as I can Americans, but I know that that is one of the most attractive features of these communities is this idea that we can live longer independently by living together and by helping each other, in that they feel like they can be healthier and stronger longer. There's the mental side of it to me, which to me is like the most important, right? So it's the cognitive challenge of being in a place where every day you're going to wake up and be forced to learn something new. And that is a fountain of youth in itself.
Oh yeah, keeping the mind active is important.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of our trifecta tagline for aging with freedom is high wealth, high health, high purpose. And
Mm-hmm.
those aren't absolute numbers. It's not like you need 1 million or 2 million to retire. You need enough
Mm-hmm.
to empower freedom of choice
Yeah.
in how you live, and in your healthcare, and you need a sense of purpose. We're social animals, so it's not enough to just sit there and as an individual with all the free time in the world. That's not very satisfying for most people. Maybe somebody,
Yeah.
but most people want to contribute and want to be important in somebody else's life. That sense of mutuality, or I'm being helpful or contributing to my community, yeah, I think is really important. You mentioned also that idea of organic or serendipitous connections
Mm-hmm.
rather than forced or required connections. Is that something that you saw in your interviews with the American retirees in Mexico?
Yeah, my kind of framework for looking at that organic community interaction was really Jane Jacobs, who was a Canadian activist or anti-gentrification, as we would say today. She looked at and she operated in New York and in Canada, but she looked at city planners as coming in and knocking out wide swaths of neighborhoods in lieu of shopping centers, as you know well-intentioned order that really destroyed community.
My wife is a landscape architect by
Okay.
original training, so we were just before COVID down to Seaside in Florida, which is kind of the poster child for new urbanism,
Hmm.
and creating these walkable, intermixed neighborhoods of work, residence, jobs, mixed age, mixed civic life that isn't so segregated or separated as most of urban and suburban America have become since the 1950s and 60s. So,
Yeah.
much more like what you describe of the environment in those expat communities that cater to Americans in Mexico.
Yeah, I mean the communities there are not defined, right? Like so Mexico does not like you don't have a business. I mean, you have a
No,
city
no zoning
center,
laws, right?
but yeah, you don't like I was talking to this real estate expert the other day and he's like, you really need to go where you're gonna buy a house because there could be a metal shop right next door to your house. And if you don't mind waking up to someone banging on horseshoes at 5 in the morning, you're gonna be fine. But just some of these common expectations we have about the division between life and business don't exist there.
Don't exist, right?
No, but that is what is attractive to people in Mexico, in these communities, is because they're going next door to a cantina next door and they're buying whatever. Or they're walking down to the fruit seller that's also in the neighborhood. One of the first time I went to Mexico when I did this original study, my wife and I had booked a hotel, right? Like a kind of like a bed and breakfast, and we got to the street where it was, and it's just gates and fences and facades, and there's no signs and there's no nothing and there's numbers, and we're like, okay, where are we? And you open up. We found the address, and what I realized is you open up these big metal gates, and that is where the beauty is, and that is where the activity is. And so it's really hard to tell from the surface. If you're familiar with a U.S. style living, you think, God, it looks like everyone's scared to death, and it looks like there's nothing here, but it's going through those archways, and then you realize, oh, I'm outside also, and I'm in a bed and breakfast. And if I look over here, there's someone's house, and if I look over here, there's a fruit stand and stuff. It's just different, and so you don't have to go really far to get all the things you need, and you can walk largely to get the things you need, and that's where you have those organic connections that we were talking about. And it's a lot easier to ask Stacy for help if you just bought a cantaloupe with her than to go
Right.
try and say, God, I really need some help with this thing. I better go find somebody to help me.
So, what can we learn by looking at the American expat community of retirees in Mexico that might benefit those of us in the United States or Canada that are preparing for retirement? Are there any, things that we can generalize from those specific observations about the Mexican retirees that maybe can help the rest of us have successful retirements regardless of where we choose to do it?
I think one lesson is that retirement's better when it's hard. And what I mean by that is that these measures of happiness seem to come from people who are not in structured living, where bocce ball is at 9, painting is at noon, radio class is at 2. You know what I mean? Like it's when you are challenged to, just like you said, the purpose, right? When you are challenged to understand and then pursue your purpose, like that you have something on the horizon that you're doing on your own and that isn't being dictated to you by anyone else. I think that's what we need to learn. Like this, like we have to stop with so many schedules, right? And this idea that if you can go to a place where someone can tell you what to do all day, you're going to be happiest. I don't think that is hasn't proven statistically to make people happy, right?
And I think that is true, is that leisure alone does not make, or even money alone doesn't make you happy if you don't have something that gives a sense of purpose or mission in life. And, I have a friend that summarized it that retirement's the time to choose significance. But the challenge is that we have nobody telling us what to do in retirement. So we have to tell ourselves
Mm.
what is significant or what is purposeful in order to fill that kind of internal need for emotional and intellectual satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a hunger there, but we have to feed it. And that does require, some effort and even some challenge. I
Yeah.
like the fact that you observe that, there's an inherent amount of challenge and intellectual activity just in the effort of integrating into a different environment or into a different culture in particular.
Hmm.
The number of people that were learning second languages
Hmm.
in your book was pretty significant.
Hmm.
That would be hard for most of us, right?
Yeah, but I think it's hard for anybody, right? Like, I
Right,
mean, I'm
right.
I'm I'm trying to do it too, and I'm trying to teach my kids Spanish, and it's hard. It's always hard, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And I guess the other thing I'd say is a big takeaway is what I want other generations to take away from this book, which is that I held limiting beliefs about baby boomers and seniors in general, right? And I think I did a good job of trying to dispel that
So just like you
retired.
defeated some of your preconceptions in
Yeah.
Mexico, right?
Right, exactly. And that's why I know that this book is important and good, because it was transformative to me in so many ways. I know that it matters because it changed the way I looked at so many aspects of the world and my own thoughts, right? I didn't let my own biases dictate what the narrative of the book was going to be. But I hope what my generation takes away is that I also had these preconceived notions about what a retired person is like. And I went through and I said, look, all these stereotypes that we hold, that you're too tired, that you can't learn a new language, that you can't be on your own, that you don't want to come up with your own schedule, that blah, 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 blah. I said, that's all, that you don't want to have sex, right? That's all wrong. Like, it's all wrong. That this is a vibrant cohort of people who have expectations for themselves and who still want to have an impact on the world, and who should go out there and do it. And they're going to be more happy and most happy when they do.
So we've been talking with entrepreneur and author Travis Luther, author of The Fun Side of the Wall. And the book is about Americans living abroad in retirement in Mexico and some of the things that they have in common with each other, and maybe some of the differences that they have with their peers who have retired in the United States. Before we go, Travis, if there's somebody that they get through reading your book and they want some other resources, and in your book you mentioned several media resources and other books that you found particular value in. If somebody's interested in retirement in Mexico and wants additional examples, maybe wants some YouTube or some video to explore the topic more, what are some of your favorite sources? Who do you like to watch or read in this topic?
Well, I think that International Living magazine does a really good job of.
They're almost the topical expert here because they literally cover the world, right?
Yeah, they do. They're great. For as far as like cost of living and stuff, I would go to numbeo.com if you're familiar with that, numbeo.com. And what that is it's self-reporting of people all over the world about what their costs are. Basically, this is what my bread basket costs. And so you can compare your own city to cities in Mexico, Europe, or wherever, to get an understanding of not just the cost of living, but they also do a crime index as well that I think is really valuable.
Yeah, I've had friends that have, lived in Belize and in Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
for instance, and so those are also, fairly popular destinations for early retirees.
Yep. And then at our own site, which is mightybuffalo.com, I've just started a podcast putting people I've interviewed in the book on air, and starting to parse out some more of the data into
So
different
some of the
articles.
storytelling there too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep,
Okay.
exactly.
We like to hear the data's helpful. I mean, that's one of the things that's a great contribution from your book. Really
Mm-hmm.
appreciated, the data focus and the use of surveys. We know surveys are a little bit self-limited, but
Mm-hmm.
this is a big set of data. It wasn't
Mm-hmm.
just a handful, so that was significant. But we like to color the data with some personal stories, and while you've got several in the book, being able to extend beyond that, maybe see some of the people and or hear them in podcasts or video casts, that can be really helpful to people who are considering whether this might be for them.
Exactly.
Well, Travis, I really appreciate your time. It's been fun talking with you both on the entrepreneurship and on your work as an author with The Fun Side of the Wall. Just fascinating opportunities for, personal fulfillment. This is the classic Maslow hierarchy, right? Is
Mhm.
that, we have this opportunity both as we prepare for retirement and in retirement to really become the people that we've always envisioned, and to see that self-realization played out in some of your stories from the Mexico retirees was a lot of fun. I think that the I don't know what you're thinking about for the next story beyond this, but I think it would be interesting to look at some of the other enclaves of retirees, like the villages in Florida. You mentioned Sun City in Arizona. There are several of these collections that, yeah, I wonder if this isn't just an example of Bill Bishop's The Big Sort. You mentioned
Mm.
the difference in terms of political orientation for the residents, the expats in Mexico.
Mhm.
And I wonder if this isn't, an illustration of the big sort of people looking for others that share their common interests to create those serendipitous or organic communities. But great, great read. Appreciate it. Appreciate your time and coming and talking with us, and look forward to staying connected.
I appreciate it too. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Travis. Have a great afternoon.
You too.
This is Dan Weingarten with Aging with Freedom. This has been our interview with Travis Luther, the author of The Fun Side of the Wall, the story of American retirees in Mexico. Have a great day and stay connected with Aging with Freedom at agingwithfreedom.com. Thank you kindly.